Jack had always dreamed of disappearing. Not in the mysterious, escape artist way, but in the, I wish I could vanish from this hellhole, kind of way. A boring job, a dull apartment, and a life that barely registered on anyone's radar. The most exciting part of his week was trying to figure out which Netflix show he could binge-watch while mindlessly scrolling through his phone. His boss, Carla, was the kind of woman who had too much caffeine in her bloodstream and not enough common sense. "Jack," she snapped, interrupting his thoughts, "do you realize we're behind on this deadline? You need to pull your weight." Jack didn't respond immediately. He was busy imagining ways to escape, anything to avoid the monthly lecture about his lack of enthusiasm for a job that didn't even make sense half the time. The spreadsheet he was supposed to be filling out might as well have been written in ancient Sumerian. Who needed that kind of stress? His hand hovered over the mouse, and for a split second, Jack wished he could just disappear. Maybe I could be like one of those guys who gets abducted by aliens. No one would miss me anyway. Just, poof, gone. Then it happened. Not the aliens part, but something even more bizarre. He vanished. Right in front of Carla. Gone. Just like that. At first, Jack thought it was a joke. He'd been caught up in his own daydreams, maybe dozing off in a trance. But no. The room around him didn't change. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the smell of Carla's overpriced perfume, everything remained the same, except for one thing. He couldn't see himself. Nor could Carla. He stared at her from the other side of the room. Her mouth was still moving, but the words were lost on him. She looked flustered, scanning the room, and then started to yell. "Jack! Jack, where are you?" A thrill shot through him, an odd combination of panic and excitement. "Oh. My. God. This is actually happening." His voice echoed in his ears, but to her, there was nothing but the sound of her own confusion. He was invisible, no longer a part of her world, nor anyone else's for that matter. A few seconds passed before he realized that if he didn't say something soon, he might actually get away with this. Jack cleared his throat dramatically, loud enough for Carla to hear. "Are you talking to yourself now, Carla?" His voice was unusually smug, tinged with an edge of glee. Carla's head jerked in the direction of his voice. She blinked, her confusion deepening. "What? Who's there? Who's messing around?" Jack couldn't help himself. He wanted to see how far this could go. He stepped behind her chair and leaned in close. She flinched, clearly sensing something, but she couldn't pinpoint where the sensation was coming from. "Boo!" Jack yelled, and he could practically hear her heart jump out of her chest. It felt like something out of a bad horror movie, and Jack couldn't stop himself from laughing. "You, Jack!" Carla practically screamed, spinning around in her seat. "Where are you?" "Oh, I'm right here, Carla," Jack said, unable to resist the sarcasm. "Right in front of you. Bet you can't see me now." Carla was looking everywhere, but at him. Jack did a little dance, spinning in circles, making himself dizzy with amusement. He had never felt this alive. For the first time in years, Jack realized he had absolute control over a situation. All he had to do was think it, and he was gone. No more mundane meetings, no more angry bosses. He was invisible. After a few moments, he decided it was time to reveal himself. He let his form materialize in front of her, his body becoming visible again. She jumped back, hands raised as if ready to swat away a ghost. "Jack. What the hell is going on?" Carla was now looking at him like he was some kind of freak. "What was that? Are you doing some sort of magic trick?" "I swear, nope," Jack interrupted, grinning like a maniac. "No tricks here. I'm just, well, invisible." Carla froze. "Invisible?" Her brow furrowed, unsure whether to laugh or call security. "Is this some sort of prank? Did you drink something weird for lunch?" Are you, I swear, Carla? No tricks. I can do this all day if you want. Jack was having too much fun, watching Carla's face shift between horror and disbelief. You're insane, she muttered under her breath, her gaze narrowing. How are you even doing this? Jack puffed out his chest. I don't know. It just sort of happened. You know, like a superpower, I guess. Carla just shook her head. This is too much. I can't, I'm gonna go, Jack said casually. You can't see me anyway. Without waiting for her response, Jack turned and walked out of the office, leaving Carla standing in the middle of the room, her eyes wide in utter confusion. As he exited the building, he couldn't help but laugh. He had never been so exhilarated in his entire life. Invisible, he thought. Invisible. Jack's life, for the first time in years, had just gotten interesting. What was once a dull, predictable existence now seemed like a blank canvas waiting to be filled with mischief, chaos, and maybe, just maybe, something a little more significant. That it didn't take long for Jack to realize that his little trick could be far more than just a gag. The ability to disappear wasn't just a fleeting moment of fun, it was a superpower, a real-life edge that could make him someone important. What if he could be something more? What if he could be part of something bigger than himself? It was the thought of that, something bigger, that led Jack to the mysterious government program that had been looking for volunteers. They didn't call it Project Spectre, but that's what he soon learned it was, a program designed to create an elite group of soldiers, all equipped with nanotechnology that could make them vanish at will. A week later, after a series of strange interviews and background checks that felt more like an interrogation, Jack found himself signing a waiver for what seemed like a sci-fi military experiment. They said he was chosen for his ability to handle the mental strain of the procedure. Whatever that meant. But the truth was, he'd always wanted something more. Something that didn't involve spreadsheets, meetings, and half-hearted apologies to his boss. Jack was led into a sterile, white facility, a place that smelled like antiseptic and metal. They strapped him to a table and began attaching tiny, almost invisible wires to his body. A small screen in the corner flickered to life, showing a diagram of his muscles, his bones, his nervous system. Are you sure about this? The technician asked. He had an air of caution, as if even he wasn't entirely convinced about the procedure's safety. Jack nodded. It's not like I have anything better to do. They injected him with something cold and numbing, and the last thing Jack saw before everything went black was the doctor's worried expression. Jack awoke hours later in a recovery room. The pain was minimal, mostly a dull ache in his head, like he had been hit with a 2x4. He rubbed his eyes, and when his fingers passed over his face, he could feel it. There was something different. Something was missing. Or, rather, something had been added. He glanced around the room, but everything seemed ordinary. A hospital bed, a small table with a glass of water, a few machines with blinking lights. Then, it hit him. He was invisible. Again. Not just his body, but his very presence. He had faded into the surroundings, like a ghost. His heart raced as he tried to focus. The panic crept in, but he stopped himself. No, he thought. This was what I wanted. This is why I came here. In the corner of the room, a mirror. Jack stood before it, trying to focus on his reflection. But all he saw was an outline, a faint, shifting blur of a person. No face. No features. Only an impression of his own body. Something deep inside him shifted. This was no longer just a joke. This was real, and real meant that, from this point on, his life would never be the same again. Jack's heart raced as he stood frozen before the mirror, his reflection barely a wisp of distortion in the glass. He didn't know what to expect, but the absence of his own face, the absence of his own self, made him feel like he was losing touch with reality. His fingertips brushed over the glass, and his reflection, what was left of it, flickered. He could see his shape, but it felt wrong. Like the reflection wasn't really him, like he was looking at someone else's life. Get a grip, Jack, he muttered under his breath. You knew this was coming. He reached out, touching his own face. There was a coldness there, a foreignness. He had expected something different, maybe some sleek sci-fi gadgetry, some visible change in his appearance, but it wasn't like that. His body was there, but it wasn't. It was as if he was slowly turning into air. A low hum sounded from the corner of the room. A tech had entered. Jack turned sharply toward the sound, but it wasn't a natural movement. He didn't need to move to face someone. He was already facing them, standing right there, and yet, the moment he turned, the figure in the room, dressed in a lab coat, didn't react. Hello? Who's there? The voice was a little shaky. Jack blinked. He hadn't meant to test his invisibility this way, but the sudden realization that no one could see him, even when they were within a few feet of him, was unsettling. He watched the technician glance around nervously, his face scrunched with confusion. Jack stepped closer, testing the boundaries of this new reality. He wasn't used to feeling so utterly untethered from the world. He reached forward, grazing the technician's shoulder lightly. The man didn't flinch. His hand passed right through him. That wasn't just invisibility, it was as if Jack wasn't there at all. He stepped back, taking in the full implications of what was happening. This wasn't some minor inconvenience. He wasn't just playing tricks now. He had crossed a line that he wasn't sure he could ever cross back. The technician shuffled toward the door, muttering to himself. Jack's instincts screamed to stop him, to grab the man by the arm and demand answers, but he couldn't. The more Jack thought about it, the more he felt disconnected. It was as if the weight of his body no longer carried any importance. No one could see him. And that was when it hit him that he wasn't invisible anymore, he had become a ghost. Not just in the sense of being unseen, but in the sense of no longer existing. He was fading, and the more he disappeared from the eyes of the world, the less he felt like he mattered. The door clicked shut, and Jack stood still, breathless. In the cold silence of the room, he realized the world outside was moving on without him. He could have walked out right then, left the facility, gone anywhere. But he stayed. He stayed because something deep down told him he wasn't ready to face the truth yet. The truth that maybe, just maybe, he had lost himself completely. Days passed before Jack was allowed to leave the sterile, quiet recovery room. The technicians had performed a few more tests, asking him questions about his physical and mental state, but Jack wasn't sure if any of it was real. How could it be when everything around him seemed so alien? Walking out into the world again, it felt different. He could walk among crowds and not a single person would know he was there. No one would glance his way, no one would offer him a second look. It was exhilarating at first, the kind of power you only read about in comic books. But then it became unsettling. The thrill of being unnoticed was fleeting, replaced by the growing dread that maybe he wasn't just invisible to others. Maybe he was invisible to himself. Jack wandered through the city, dodging pedestrians who unknowingly bumped into him. It was like being a ghost in his own life. He passed by old coffee shops, the familiar street corners, and the park bench where he and Sarah used to sit on lazy afternoons. Everything was the same. Everything except him. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He fumbled to take it out, his fingers brushing against his phone screen, feeling the cool glass surface. He had no idea how he had been able to hold it. His body was disappearing, piece by piece, but somehow, the phone still remained in his hand. He unlocked the screen and saw a message from Sarah. Hey, Jack. Can we talk? I need to tell you something important. He read the message again. It hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment, he forgot about everything, the nanotech, the invisibility, the creeping sense that he wasn't real. All he could think about was Sarah, the girl who had once meant everything to him. The girl who had walked away that he hadn't heard from her in weeks. She had just disappeared from his life one day. That was the last time he had felt truly seen. The sudden urge to contact her was overwhelming. He wanted to explain to her, to tell her what had happened to him, but he knew he couldn't. What could he say? He wasn't just invisible to the world now, he was invisible to himself. Jack spent the next few days in a haze. He went back to his apartment and paced the floor, staring at the walls, trying to remember what it felt like to be whole. He'd caught glimpses of himself in windows, or reflections on shiny surfaces, but they didn't make sense. He looked like a person. He sounded like a person. But something about him was wrong. He couldn't feel his body the same way anymore. It was like the world around him was becoming a faint blur, like his entire existence was slowly disintegrating, bit by bit, the longer he used the nanotech. The more invisible he became, the less he was aware of anything at all. The nanotech hadn't just given him the power to disappear, it had slowly started to take away everything else that made him human. His memories were blurry. He forgot small details at first, like what he had for breakfast or where he put his keys. But now, he was forgetting bigger things. His childhood, his family, his favorite movies, the names of his best friends. One night, as he sat in front of the television, trying to watch something, anything, to distract himself, the screen flickered, then turned to static. He stared at it for a long time, as if the empty screen had become the only thing he could rely on. That's when he heard it. A voice. Soft, but unmistakable. Jack. He spun around, his heart racing. No one was there. The room was empty. He stood, his pulse thumping in his ears, and he turned in circles, his eyes wide, searching for anyone, anything. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Jack," the voice repeated. It was a woman's voice, but it wasn't Sarah. It was a voice he didn't recognize, yet it felt familiar in a way that made him want to run. He stumbled backward, his mind racing to make sense of it. His body wasn't just invisible, it was fading from reality. The voice, if it even existed, wasn't just calling to him, it was calling him back, pulling him toward the edge of something. The realization hit him with a wave of cold terror. He was slipping. Slipping out of the world entirely. Jack made a decision. He would go back to the program, to the place where it all started. He had to find a way to reverse this. He had to stop himself from vanishing completely. The next morning, Jack found himself back at the facility, though he wasn't sure if he had ever truly left it. He slipped inside the building, unnoticed, and made his way to the lab where it all began. The door was unlocked. He stepped inside, and this time, it wasn't a sense of power that washed over him. It was dread. Every step he took felt like it was leading him further into the unknown. He found the lead technician, the one who had been with him through the implantation process. The technician turned as Jack approached, but his eyes passed over him, not even recognizing his presence. Jack reached out, grabbing the man by the arm. But there was no reaction. "Help me," Jack whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't know how much longer I have left." The technician's eyes slowly widened, and for the briefest moment, Jack saw something shift in his expression. Recognition. But before he could say anything, the world around him began to fade again. This time, not just his body, but the entire room was blurring, slipping into nothingness. He had only one choice now, to fight for what little of himself he had left. Before he disappeared completely, the world around Jack felt like it was disintegrating, falling away in fragments. His hands, which should have been there to grasp something solid, hovered as if they no longer belonged to him. The room was fading, the walls dissolving, the faint outline of the technician's face warping like an old photograph left out in the sun. It was as if every part of him, every connection he once had to the real world, was simply unraveling. His chest tightened. He could feel his heart thudding in his chest, but it was becoming faint, distant, like his heartbeat was coming from a place miles away. The technician's expression slowly shifted, a flicker of recognition passing across his face as Jack's hand gripped his arm with growing desperation. "Help me," Jack rasped, the words barely audible, his voice slipping into the void. The technician's lips parted as if to respond, but the words never came. Instead, Jack's body trembled as the last vestiges of the room around him continued to dissolve into a void. He was vanishing. Not just invisibility this time. The nanotech had taken it further. He was no longer just a ghost, he was becoming nothing at all. He stumbled back, looking frantically for something to anchor himself to, but there was nothing left. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, they were all gone, replaced by an overwhelming emptiness. Even the technician was fading away, like an image losing its focus. I need to fight this, Jack thought, his mind struggling to find clarity amidst the disintegration. But how? The nanotech was beyond him now. It was rewriting his very existence, erasing everything that defined him. His fingers trembled as he looked down at them. He could still see them, barely. The faintest outline of his hand, translucent at best. If I disappear completely, Jack realized, then I'm gone forever. No one will even remember I existed. His mind raced through the possibilities. There had to be something, some way to reverse the effects of the nanotech. Something to restore what was slipping away, to bring himself back into the world of the visible and the tangible. But the more he thought about it, the more elusive the answer became. Everything he had known, everything he had been, was dissolving in front of his eyes, and then, as if in response to his panic, a thought crystallized in his mind: the nanotech. He had signed up for this, volunteered for it, eager to disappear at first, but now the very thing that had given him the power to vanish was the thing that was stealing him away. I need to reverse it. I have to stop it. But how? The technician was gone now, lost to the void, and Jack was alone in an empty, intangible space, the faintest trace of himself slipping further away. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on the pieces of his life that still lingered in his memory. He remembered his apartment, the sound of his mother's laugh, the taste of coffee on lazy mornings with Sarah. He remembered his old job, the mundane routine of it all. None of those things were gone yet, they were still alive in his mind. At least, the problem wasn't that he was fading from the world, it was that he was fading from himself. Jack took a deep breath, focusing all his mental energy on the one thing that still remained: the nanotech, the microscopic machines that had invaded his body. If they could make him invisible, then surely, there must be a way to control them. To reverse their influence. He had to regain control before he lost everything. The room around him flickered again, and Jack blinked. The edges of reality were distorting, warping, and for a brief moment, he could almost see his own reflection again, a fractured, blurry version of himself, but something. Just the slightest hint of his presence. He stumbled forward, falling to his knees, his body no longer certain where it was in space. He didn't know how much longer he could hold on to himself, but he couldn't let go. Not now. Not yet. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket again. He barely registered it at first. His body was fading, his senses slipping. But then, the vibrations became louder, clearer, more real than anything else around him. The phone. His lifeline. With shaking hands, he fumbled for the device, the screen already lit up. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the message: "Jack, please respond. I've been trying to reach you." It was from Sarah. The thought of her sent a sharp pang through his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something real. He could still feel it, that thread of connection to her, even if it was faint. Even if she had already left him behind. He couldn't let go of that feeling. His thumb brushed over the screen. "Please, Sarah. Please don't let me vanish." He quickly typed a reply, his fingers fumbling over the words. "I'm losing myself. I don't know how much longer I have. I need to see you." A few moments passed before her response came through. "I'm here. I'm coming to you." He stared at the words, his vision blurring as he struggled to focus. His mind was racing. He didn't know how much time he had left. He didn't even know how to get to her. But something, some part of him, refused to accept the idea of disappearing without a fight. Not without seeing her one last time. Without thinking, Jack stood up, his legs shaking. He didn't know how much of his body was still there, but he willed himself to move, to push through the void that surrounded him. The apartment, the streets, everything was gone. He was fading, but the memory of Sarah's face burned brightly in his mind. It was the only thing keeping him tethered. He didn't know how he was still able to walk, to move at all. It was as if his body was no longer his, a ghost of itself, a half-presence in a world he couldn't feel. But he kept going, step by slow step, moving toward the door. He had to find her. He had to find something real before it was all lost. The last of the world around him seemed to collapse in on itself, and Jack stumbled into the street. He couldn't even feel the ground beneath his feet anymore. It was like he was walking through an endless fog. But the thought of Sarah kept him moving. His phone buzzed again, louder this time, pulling him back to reality. The message was from her again. "I'm almost there, Jack. Stay with me." Jack's eyes filled with tears as he held the phone up, the screen shimmering with her words. The connection was still there. The thread that kept him tied to the world. "Sarah," Jack whispered. "I'm still here. I won't disappear." But the world around him was fading faster now. The buildings were mere outlines, the cars around him just blurs of motion. He could barely hear the sound of the street anymore, and the voices that had once filled his ears were growing distant. Jack's legs buckled. He crumpled to the ground, feeling the cold asphalt press against his knees. He could still see the phone in his hand, and he clung to it like it was his lifeline. His heartbeat was slowing, the familiar sensation of the world slipping away as the void consumed him. He wasn't sure if it was his body or the nanotech that was betraying him. But he wasn't going to let it win. Not now. He needed to fight for his place in the world. He needed to fight for Sarah. He couldn't hear her footsteps. He couldn't feel the ground beneath him. All he had was the phone, and the faintest memory of her face. And then, just as everything started to go dark, he heard her voice again, distant but unmistakable. "Jack." This time, it was real. This time, he could feel her presence, and then, everything went silent.